there were some very interesting reports by NBC of all places in Crimea, and I wanted to cover this. So NBC sent a reporter to Crimea. You're not supposed to go there. You're not supposed to go to the Donbass like Wyatt Reed did and show what it's like being under the guns of the Ukrainian US supplied military. And you're not supposed to go talk to Crimeans, those people who actually voted to leave the Ukrainian state after 2014 when it was taken over in a nationalist pro-NATO coup. This ethnic Russian population did not want to be part of that government. And so now NBC has sent a reporter there, which is very interesting. I don't think this could have happened without some kind of consent or a green light from the State Department. So let's watch what takes place.
Is Crimea Russian or Ukrainian?
Russian,
Crimea
конечно.
is Russian.
Да.
Of course, Russian. 73-year-old crack Soviet tells me. Zelensky will not get Crimea back because we have our commander-in-chief, Putin.
Голова команды, Putin.
Every one of them told us that they are Russian and that if President Zelensky thinks Ukrainian forces can come here, they will fight them. President Zelensky has said that the Ukraine war started here and it will end here, but no one was able to tell us how it will end and how much more blood will be spilt. Is Crimea...
And there was a interesting exchange between that reporter and Andrea Mitchell, where he said that this area is completely honeycombed with Russian military. You see it everywhere. It would be practically impossible for Ukraine to recapture it. It would just be a major military confrontation. And it is Russia's red line, which would mean that if Crimea were attacked, Russia would escalate massively, possibly with like a tactical nuclear weapon. Andrea Mitchell didn't really challenge him on that. She seemed to be accepting it. And Andrea Mitchell, as we know, she's just a megaphone for the State Department. So something interesting is happening here, Aaron. And before we, get your thoughts, let's just show what happened to this reporter. Keir Simmons from NBC News went to Crimea and reported that most Crimeans are pro-Russia. Now Ukraine has put him on its hit list website for reporting this fact. This is Myrotvorets. It is a kill list that contains the names of journalists, Russian activists and Russian spies, but also just journalists. Americans are on it. Roger Waters is on it. Children are on it, like Faina Savankova, who I've interviewed for the Grayzone. And now a U.S. journalist from a mainstream outlet is on it. And we haven't heard anything from NBC about this. And this being all added to this website has real world consequences. Oleg Buzina, who is a Ukrainian journalist in Kiev, was gunned down in 2015 by a Ukrainian SBU-backed far-right hit squad, a death squad. So this is serious. Aaron, what do you think is going on here? Why are we finally hearing about the reality of Crimea?
I wonder if the people behind this hit list are also going to put on the Gallup, like the polling firm, and the U.S. Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is a U.S. government-funded organization, which have done polling in Crimea since 2014, which repeatedly find that most Crimeans want to join Russia and are happy with the annexation. Also, the pollsters who wrote in Foreign Affairs a few years ago that their polling also shows that the majority of Crimeans want to be a part of Russia. Because all this reporter is doing is just telling the truth. It's obvious to anyone who's been to Crimea. Whether you accept the results of the referendum or not, the polls conducted by the U.S. show exactly what that referendum resulted in, which is that most Crimeans want to join Russia. And why I think this is happening, we're seeing this now, is because I think there's a split inside the Biden White House. There are people like Victoria Nuland who I think want to give Ukraine the weapons that it wants to try to take Crimea, but other people who recognize that this is a World War III provoking incident, that this could cause Russia to use nuclear weapons. They don't want to have that, and so that's why I think we're seeing that divide now. And there's been a push by the people like Nuland to do this, to have Ukraine try to take Crimea. There was a leak to the New York Times in January, and we talked about this last week, and the headline was U.S. warms to helping Ukraine take Crimea or something like that. The word warms was used. So there's some people who are warm to this idea of World War III, but other people who know what that would mean are not. And so that's why I think that's created space inside these people's stenographers to reflect that divide.
100%. And here's the interview with Andrea Mitchell, where essentially Andrea Mitchell, married to Alan Greenspan, charter member of the Beltway foreign policy elite and just the Beltway elite. As I said, I don't think any of this would have taken place without some kind of consent from the State Department as a result of Zelensky declaring he was going to retake it. But here's that interview.
On Sunday to take back
We'll just play
Crimea.
a portion of this because it's kind of long.
How realistic is that?
I mean, you just listen to the tone of her voice. How realistic is that? That's her first question. And she's teeing it up for him to say it's unrealistic. And they're sending a message to Zelensky. It's not going to happen, buddy.
People there whom you spoke to view themselves as Russian.
That's right. From those people that we spoke to, it seemed unrealistic. And Andrew, I want to show you some new picture that we filmed yesterday at the port of Sevastopol. Now, this is the closest that any US news crew has got to the Russian Black Sea fleet in many, many years. What you're seeing here are President Putin's ships at that port. Why it's important is because Vladimir Putin will be determined to defend that port, to not have it taken away from him. He may well do pretty much anything to try to achieve that. And the reason why is because it is so strategically important to Russia. But here's the irony. The fact since he launched that invasion a year ago in Ukraine, Ukrainians now will be determined not to have the Black Sea fleet there, potentially threatening their coast for years to come. So it is a very, very dangerous standoff that suggests that this could pan out for some time to come. It's hard to see how you reach a negotiation over that. And there in Sevastopol, Andrew, I've got to tell you, I mean, there was just military everywhere, absolutely everywhere. It is a military town. So again, when, for example, Victoria Nuland talks about, at the very least, we want Crimea to be demilitarized, I found myself standing there and wondering, how on earth does that happen?
Yeah, I mean,
Nuclear war. Yeah.
Great point. And I mean, Sevastopol, the Battle of Sevastopol was one of the most intense and terrible losses for the Soviet Union in World War II. The few survivors had to be smuggled out on submarines. The history there is still present today. I mean, the ghosts of that history linger over present day Sevastopol. The port of Sevastopol is why Russia annexed Crimea. They cannot afford to lose that. And at the same time, the Ukrainian military understands that it's the gateway to a Russian offensive on Odessa. And the attacks on the Kerch Bridge appear to have been carried out, at least our understanding, based on classified files we obtained that Kit Klarenberg reported.
Oh, yeah, that's right. God, that was speaking of big stories that get overlooked, that was a huge expose.
It was a huge story, and it showed that the Odessa wing of the SBU, it was the Odessa wing of the SBU, possibly working with British intelligence to carry that out. They certainly planned it out, and if Odessa SBU with British consultation has prepared a secret partisan terror army to carry out those attacks on Crimea, and that's what they want to authorize, which would lead us into this devastating cycle of escalation going towards nuclear conflict, which I think the Biden administration is using this report to kind of push back on that. Wouldn't you say?
Let me shout out all of our media colleagues who ignored this story because it was published in the Grayzone. And according to their professional way of looking at the media, the Grayzone has cooties, so they couldn't admit that the Grayzone obtained these UK documents showing that UK operatives helped to plot to blow up a bridge in Crimea. And
we just had the raw documents, like raw
we
classified documents. It's like WikiLeaks.
Yeah. But you didn't see that you didn't see that reported on Democracy. That didn't make Democracy Now's headlines. That wasn't reported elsewhere because we're the ones who published it. So it can't. It's like if the New York Times reports something, then totally fine for lefty media to report it. But there are some people who think that if the Grayzone does it, then they can't acknowledge its existence. So shout out to them.
That was one of the major stories of the war that Kit Klarenberg reported.
Yeah.
And we just had the raw files.
Yeah.
Cy Hirsch had a source who I think is a very well-placed source, a very credible source, but we just showed you what was actually taking place, from the plans to blow up Kerch Bridge to the emails and various discussions about carrying out terror attacks in Crimea between British intelligence officials and the Ukrainian SBU. It was all there. So I see it as kind of consistent with the cover-up of Cy Hirsch's report. These major stories that explain how the sausage is being made in this war and show the U.S. and its allies carrying out straight-up terror attacks to provoke the Russian Federation. You're not allowed to report it. There's a total blackout. We have some. Go ahead.
In that clip, did I hear that NBC News reporter say that these here are President Putin's ships, right? As if like those ships in the port there personally belong to Putin.
Yeah,
it's such a facet of NATO state propaganda to reduce everything in a foreign country to being the property and the character of one individual, which is the country's leader. So the ships now all personally belong to Putin, not to Russia as a country with with a lot of people in it. It's just it's the classic trope that they always pursue.
Yeah, during the Russiagate psyop, Putin was said to be the richest man in the world, and it was because his fortune was chalked up as all of the Russian state's public holdings. Okay, so he's worth billions and billions. He was worth more than Jeff Bezos, they said, because the Russian state owns lots of property, and I guess they could have included the Russian Navy as well, but that's just the way it's all boiled down to one figure, because there isn't really a fundamental ideological conflict, or there hadn't been, between post-Soviet Russia and the US the way there was during the Cold War. So they have to make it a clash of personalities and values.